conventional worldview necessarily involves the fundamental belief in infinite space and a spinning ball world, which is claimed to be flying through space in multiple directions at the same time, along parabolic paths of travel, no less. Although no direct physical evidence supports these wild assertions of scientism, which is a rigid, inarguable set of beliefs as opposed to the actual meaning of science, and most of the world has been completely subdued into subscribing to such fantastic claims about the natural world. Scientific facts hold no aversion to scrutiny and questioning. Theoretical dogmas of scientism, on the other hand, have built empires around cherry-picking certain theories which must never be questioned or scrutinized, and many wild theories become essentially laws. This categorically transforms theoretical astrophysics and other fields directly into the antithesis of science at its essence, which is ideally an unbiased, unemotional, calculated, and logical process of discernment. The actual process of science, if applied properly, can never deceive us, and can only deliver us a refined and improved understanding of the world, either by confirming more thoroughly what we already believe to be true, or by disagreeing with what we thought was true and therefore opening up entirely new fields of inquiry. Scientism, on the other hand, or the forced belief in theoretical physics without any basis in evidence or actuality, will never achieve anything but the aggrandizement of theorists and entrenching the culture in a quagmire of deception. Hundreds of years have been spent honing the theoretical case for the ball, as well as methods of indoctrinating the public into the belief system involved with infinite space. Whether or not the institutionalization of the ball Earth theory was the result of an intentional deception or the result of misguided men with the best of intentions, the end results are the same. We are all doomed to be conditioned into firm belief in the preposterous theory that we're all stuck to the side of a spinning ball in the vacuum of space during a phase in our life when we're highly suggestible to outrageous assertions. More importantly, during this phase in our life, we're forced into the belief system when our budding minds are still forming the person we eventually become. The things we learn during adolescence often leave profound and lasting impressions on who we are, even if we don't consciously realize such things overtly. Subconsciously, our personalities are formed largely during the first decade of our life, more or less. This combination of gullibility and lasting impressionability are quite dangerous if allowed into the wrong hands. The fact that the ball Earth and infinite space hypothesis are forced into our cultural belief system during our adolescence is a big red flag on the topic. Another red flag is the fact that anyone who disagrees with or doubts or even questions the topic is ridiculed, insulted, and verbally attacked. Is there any other branch of science which doesn't welcome constructive criticism or logical skepticism? And let's be honest here, the exact dimensions of the spinning ball Earth and the velocities of it allegedly are certainly mentioned in primary school curriculum as well as higher education. The alleged size and velocity of the ball Earth can be recited by any old middle school student. But when it comes to actually proving the curvature or the motion of the Earth with direct observation or measurement or experiment, the ball Earth leaves plenty to be desired, and so the details are largely ignored by the educational system. For example, never in many years of primary school nor college did I ever conduct, learn about, or even really hear of one single experiment to project the exact amount of curvature you should necessarily expect upon this ball Earth. It really isn't until one starts looking into the prospect of flat Earth that you will begin to learn exactly just how curved the ball Earth should be if it were actually a sphere. And this fact is telling, that it is flat earthers who are the ones who know exactly how spherical the world should be. The same exact situation applies to the purported motion of the Earth. We're all convinced at a very young age that the Earth is spinning around its axis, which amounts to a curvilinear velocity in excess of 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, and faster than the speed of sound in most places in the United States. While it may take a bit of convincing for a toddler to agree that the world is a spinning ball, I submit that if you were to find a grown adult who had never heard of the ball Earth theory and try to convince him the immovable ground beneath his feet is actually racing along a curve faster than a bullet, you'd never in a million years be able to succeed at such a ruse. The fact of the matter is, the ground which we're all very familiar with is, in fact, very stationary, just as our senses tell us. Thanks to our adolescent indoctrination, the concept of the supersonic spinning world has become something we just sort of take for granted, if we even think about it at all. Although nobody has ever experienced the ground actually in curvilinear motion beneath their feet, 99 people out of 100 will deem you a stunted lunatic if you disagree with or even question these assertions of lions. And of course, this axial rotation of the Earth is only the beginning of the alleged velocities of the Earth. They claim we're supposedly orbiting around the Sun at over 66,000 miles an hour, orbiting the galactic center at over 480,000 miles an hour, as the galaxy itself is alleged to hurl through the infinite space at some millions of miles per hour, and these directions or velocities are often in conflict with one another. Of course, if you search for any tangible evidence of all this curvilinear conflicting motion at inconceivable velocities, you'll find nothing but the ever-stationary Earth, which has never moved, sans perhaps a bit of tectonic shift of the land masses. Proponents for the preposterous ball Earth theory will assert that, while the Earth is indeed a fixed frame of reference, this is only relative, as our motion through space exactly matches that of the Earth's motion through space, ergo we don't notice any of these wild velocities. They're essentially claiming that we don't notice any of the motion, as there's no acceleration involved, therefore the world can be in all of this motion and still be a fixed frame of reference for us little observers, especially thanks to the atmosphere, which is also in constant lockstep with the spinning and twirling through space Earth. Now, this sort of argument about not noticing it due to lack of acceleration may appease toddlers, and it may also appease adults who are comfortable with never questioning lions about the ball, but it certainly leaves me begging for answers. The fact of the matter is, a primary body in motion can only be considered a fixed reference frame for secondary objects which are fastened to the primary body securely. Any acceleration of either body will cause a change in the reference frame and will result in apparent motion of either object. So if you're in a train traveling straight down the tracks at a consistent speed, it's much easier to jog towards the rear of the train than it is to jog towards the front. This is because you enjoy the luxury of the rear of the train meeting you in the middle of the journey when you're running towards the rear, but when heading towards the front, you're in a race against the front. This proves conclusively that we should have an easier time heading west rather than east on the spinning ball Earth, because, of course, the destination would be racing to meet you in the middle while you're heading west, and you do not get to enjoy that luxury when heading east, and in fact you should be racing against that destination. This fact is doubly true for planes, as they are not connected to the ground whatsoever, and although they would hypothetically be connected to the atmosphere, airplanes are designed to decrease drag and increase thrust, which means a plane accelerating towards the west should be traveling much faster relative to the objects on the ground, simply because they are racing towards one another. An eastbound plane would be racing against the destination, and so even if it does retain the momentum lent to it by the Earth prior to takeoff, it's not going to enjoy the benefit of the destination meeting it in the middle. And so the fact that westbound flights are sometimes identical in duration to eastbound flights, and often eastbound flights are much shorter in duration than westbound flights, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd expect if everything was spinning constantly towards the east. Furthermore, the fact that the Earth and the Sun and the galaxy are all allegedly in curvilinear conflicting paths of motion, you would expect to see acceleration built into this. Simply by standing on the Earth at sunrise, you should be experiencing the ground racing up towards your feet at 65,000 miles an hour, and about 12 hours later at sunset, the world will have accelerated in the complete opposite direction down away from your feet at over 65,000 miles an hour, a complete acceleration of over 130,000 miles an hour over the course of 12 hours. This acceleration would be compounded by the alleged curvilinear trajectory of the Earth, which would also be compounded or subtracted from by the alleged curvilinear trajectory of the Sun, which would also be compounded by the alleged acceleration of the galaxy. And so to claim that this fixed frame of reference is so because there is no acceleration, this is just blatant lies. Angular acceleration is built into the heliocentric theory, as traveling along a curvilinear path will always produce angular acceleration, and that is manifest as centrifugal force. And of course, the fact that these orbital trajectories are not always going to be in the same alignment, or really only once every year, they would potentially be in the same alignment for the Earth to Sun, and then once every 250 million years, they would be in a similar alignment for the Sun to the galactic center. And so that means we would constantly be experiencing acceleration due to all of these crazy orbits compounded by the alleged rotation of the Earth. So people will argue against these sorts of slam dunk, blatant, and obvious pieces of evidence against the ball Earth theory with statements like, well, it's just as difficult to travel west or east, and I know the Earth is a spinning ball, therefore, it should be just as difficult to travel west and east upon the spinning ball Earth. This sort of illogical thinking is rampant when it comes to the globe Earth believers, although this is not a jab at anyone's intelligence. Every last one of us was essentially tricked into thinking this sort of way. We're tricked into starting with the assumption that the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what evidence we see to the contrary, and incorporating that evidence into our belief of the spinning ball. So another example, what goes up must come down is definitely an astute and correct observation. Usually, high-density objects will fall to the ground when released, and this natural observation, this natural physical law, is explained away by the theory of gravity. So, if the Earth was actually a spinning ball, the last thing you would expect to see is, dense objects falling to the ground. You would expect them to naturally travel at a right angle to the axis of rotation and never touch the ground again, but thanks to the theory of gravity, objects are allowed to fall on the spinning ball Earth. So, what goes up must come down is certainly a thing. It's a natural phenomenon, and gravity is merely a theory to explain this natural phenomenon, and this theory is only necessary if you first assume that the Earth is a spinning ball. So, the fact that objects fall to the ground is not proof that the Earth is a spinning ball, nor is it proof of the theory of gravity. Dropping an object onto the ground is proof that what goes up will come down. Proving the theory of gravity is something that has never been done and will never be done, LIGO's lies certainly notwithstanding. Having said all this, there's no reason for us to continue believing in the spinning ball Earth whatsoever. These basic, verifiable facts speak for themselves, and they are indeed self-evident to anyone capable of seeing beyond the limits of what we were tricked into believing was possible. And there's so much evidence which either refutes the standard model with astronomical observations, such as Polaris' historical central position to all the other stars, in spite of alleged axial precession, observations of the full moon, rising and setting during full broad daylight, which is geometrically impossible on the globe Earth. The shadow of the moon is usually around 60 miles in diameter during solar eclipses, and as little as 2 miles in diameter, which is physically not possible if the moon is a 2,000-mile diameter object some 250,000 miles away. Light and shadow simply don't behave like that. Shadows don't diminish in angular size with distance from the obstruction. Furthermore, objects are visible from dozens or even hundreds of miles away when they should be well below the curve horizon on the ball. All the NASA and international space fakery and moon hoaxes. I mean, you could literally go on, and we have, with just all kinds of evidence, anything from theoretical to physical to debunking of the heliocentric theory. There's so much evidence which clearly disagrees with the standard model, and yet people simply refuse to look at this evidence and remain completely brainwashed by the globe Earth nonsense. Now, it's often argued that there's no way all of science and humanity could have missed such obvious facts, and it's rather presumptuous of you flat earthers to think that you've somehow found all these answers or found all these problems with the ball Earth when so many much smarter people have come and gone before us without noticing any of these glaring inconsistencies in the standard model. Now, the problem with this type of argument is first and foremost that all the people in history were apparently not looking for evidence to debunk the standard model, as they technically should have been were they diligent scientists. The reason that myself and many others are able to find so many deal-breaking problems with the standard model is simply because we've been compelled to skeptically revisit the assumptions which we were forced to subscribe to, hook, line, and sinker, while we were gullible adolescents. The men who crafted the prototype versions of the ball Earth theory, which has changed in its lies over the years, they did so very cautiously and often admitted that their works were merely theoretical, probably had no basis in truth or actuality, and should essentially be taken with a grain of salt, but they could be used for certain practical scientific applications. Furthermore, many of the dogmatic laws of theory were not arrived at by scientific process, but were instead philosophical decisions made for certain manipulative ends. The Copernican principle, for example, is not rooted in any fact, but the notion of infinite homogeneous universe where the world is nothing special is somehow safer for science to get on board with than the notion that the world is the central physical plane which was created by some intelligence and hosts the heavens as a secondary feature of the world itself. Long ago, a decision was apparently made by theoretical physics to assume the infinite universe hypothesis without ever questioning it, and by disregarding any evidence which might have disagreed with the hypothesis, quite the opposite of science. They decided to continually cherry-pick and even invent supporting evidence, circumstantial or otherwise, for the Copernican premise, and indeed transformed themselves into a phantom of anti-science which parades itself as science with a capital S and hides behind the achievements of actual practical science. Rest assured, there are no practical, useful inventions that have come from infinite space theory. There are certainly lots of practical applications for science, but infinite space theory and theoretical physics are simply not science. Science must necessarily be objective, verifiable, and falsifiable, and theoretical physics is absolutely none of those things. Now, while I cannot honestly say that I support any model of the world completely, I would also quickly mention that a model is simply not necessary to support the position that the world is flat and stationary. Basic geometry and physics confirm this beyond the shadow of any doubt, with or without supporting astronomy. Unfortunately, we've all been raised to believe that science has a complete and accurate grasp on space, although nothing could be further from the truth. Although we're expected to replace hundreds of years of bogus pseudoscience, which purports to know the exact size and distance and weight of stars, which have never been directly measured, and such stellar values will never be verified or satisfactorily falsified in a million years. The fact that we refuse to venture wild speculations or conjecture when it comes to the heavens gives our position the appearance of inferiority to our opponent's position, but of course this argument belongs in the realm of physical, measurable reality, and of what we can physically observe and verify for ourselves. At the same time, of course, all of the intricate values calculated to the umpteenth decimal can be shown with simple observation to be contrary to reality in so many ways, as mentioned earlier with Polaris being central to all the other stars in spite of the so-called precession of the axis of the Earth, the moon being visible 100% full, rising and setting during broad daylight, which is geometrically impossible, planets that are 5,000 miles in diameter, being visible with the naked eye 50 million miles away. So many problems, debunks with the very theories and values involved with the heliocentric premise. But until you skeptically criticize the heliocentric premise, and if you're incapable of admitting when certain things do not work in terms of physical reality not matching the premise, then you have absolutely no business calling yourself scientific, and you'll have absolutely no chance of understanding the truth. While I refuse to make speculative assertions about what the sun, moon, and stars are, we certainly do know they cannot be the values asserted by mainstream theorists. The standard stellar values are derived from the fundamental assumptions involved with infinite space and the ball Earth. Once the world is shown to be a stationary plane, then the concepts involved with all of this theory are completely moot, unfounded, and unrealistic. An analogy: if you were to disprove the concept of Santa Claus to a child, is it necessary to continue disproving Santa's boots, the buttons on his coat, his beard, Mrs. Claus, the reindeer, Rudolph, and his red nose? Or is it simply sufficient to prove the concept of Santa is entirely impossible at once? And what sort of proof is necessary or satisfactory to debunk Santa Claus? Is a bit of logic and common sense reason sufficient? Or is some tangible piece of evidence supposed to act as like the smoking gun disproof of Santa? Realistically, there is no real physical evidence that one can point to which categorically and satisfactorily debunks Santa Claus, which means the phenomenon cannot be satisfactorily falsified with physical evidence. Infinite space and Santa Claus have much more in common than you might think. So getting back to the models we're going to touch on real quick, and I wouldn't even go so far as to calling these models so much as projections, but we'll look at the AE, the linear, and the TEA model. And I'm not going to say that I subscribe to any of these completely, although I do have my personal preference, and I'm not going to try to persuade anyone about my personal preference, but I do urge everyone to look at the different models and decide this sort of thing for yourself. But I would also warn you not to marry yourself to any one model, because new evidence is coming in all the time. And to be true to the scientific method is to admit when you are wrong, alter your theory or your model, and then move on with the science. If you refuse to abandon failed theories or failed models, then you are no longer practicing the scientific method. Okay, so we'll start with the AE projection. This is probably the one that everyone's familiar with. Now, the reason I say this isn't a model is because it is just a projection map, which all of these lines of longitude are measured equidistant from the center point, which in this instance is the North Pole. So, for example, if you were to travel from the center of the map down this longitude line, it's fairly accurate. Although, if you travel from this point on this map to the west, that is not an accurate representation of the size and distance of that area. So it seems to me like the AE projection was built around a map that Well, the first original map that we derived the AE projection from appears to be an assumed globe. And so that is a bit of a problem, or potentially a bit of a problem. Although I do still feel like the AE projection is adequate to describe the Earth itself, and for a number of reasons. Now, I stand to be corrected on these, but if you go back to Zetetic astronomy, there appears to be lots of documentation of far south sea voyages where the Antarctic region and the far south region was attempted to be circumnavigated and mapped, and the lines of longitude appear to be longer around in the south than they are their respective longitudes in the north. And that's in real measurement of the far south seas. Now, if that's true, that's extremely damning evidence against the globe, and very good evidence to support this sort of AE projection layout. Another thing that I think the AE projection has going for it is the centrality of the North Pole star Polaris, which is apparently 90 degrees overhead the center point. All of the other stars essentially fan out from Polaris, and there are some perceived issues with the counter rotation of the stars in the far south, although we're dealing with optics, lights shining through a liquid atmosphere, and so all sorts of refraction and inversion and reflection can be possible. So the visibility of the stars apparently counter-rotating when facing south is not really necessarily a deal breaker for the AE projection. So I'll just give you an example. If you're standing in a disco where there's a light shining on a disco ball with reflections spinning all around the room, if you've got mirrors positioned all around that room and you're trying to triangulate on the lights or triangulate on the disco ball using the lights and geometry, you're going to have issues with your measurement if the room is full of liquid or something, as the atmosphere is. And so similar things can potentially be happening with the stars, and it really appears, based on what I've seen, that you do not have a central star, not even a central point in the far south, that behaves like the central point in the north. You don't have this apparent bilateral symmetry between northern hemisphere astronomy and southern hemisphere astronomy. So that also sort of points or favors the AE projection. Maybe there are multiple southern vortices of stars. Maybe there's a singular vortex that's always opposite the position of the sun, the anti-meridian of the sun's current position. These lines of latitude and longitude on all of these projections are derived from visible space astronomy. And so, again, when you're dealing with lights passing through liquid media, you can't really take distant observation measurements and to triangulate on things and to map all this stuff out without knowing exactly how the light is being affected by the natural atmosphere and other factors. If you don't know the distance of the stars, for example, you can't really do much in terms of transposing what you see in the sky into a map of the world below. So if you could just imagine a funny mirror on the ceiling and reflecting lights, similar to stars up on that funny mirror in the ceiling, if you were to try to derive cogent and correct mathematics of what those stars are doing based on the warped view of the light coming from the stars, you'd be exercising in futility. Now, certainly the AE projection does not have the issues that the globe does in terms of Polaris always being central to the other stars. In the ball Earth theory, Polaris could not possibly be central to our measly wobbly axis pointer for much longer than 50, 100 years at the most, due to alleged axial precession. That's a huge deal breaker for the ball Earth theory, and yet this AE projection doesn't have that issue. That works very well. Circumnavigation works very well on the AE projection. And, for all intents and purposes, for all we know, Antarctica could be a ring around the far south. I've never been that far south, and I've certainly never circumnavigated the far south. And by the way, nobody ever has circumnavigated the Arctic Circle, or rather the Antarctic Circle. Fedor Konyakov holds the world record for the Antarctica Cup Challenge, and he adhered mainly to the 50 and 40 and high 50 degrees south, not even near the Arctic Circle. So if anyone claims that the Antarctica Cup Challenge is actually circumnavigating the far south, it does not. It circumnavigates in the south, but not in the Antarctic Circle. So they should just call it the, subtemperate cup, certainly not the Antarctic Cup. Now, another thing that the AE projection appears to have going for it is the fact that it certainly appears that the United States, Europe, and Asia are essentially, their northern edges are wrapped around the north. So if you head north from here, you'll eventually end up here. If you head north from here, you'll eventually end up here. Physically, it does appear, based on my research, not anything that I physically can verify for myself. I've never taken a boat across the North Pole to Russia or China, right? But it does appear, based on things that we can verify to the best of our ability, it does appear that this sort of layout is correct. And this is very similar to what's going on in the northern hemisphere in the globe. There's honestly not much difference between the northern hemisphere on the globe and on the AE projection, and so this actually works out very nicely. You've also got flight paths that, when mapped on the globe, they, especially for southern destinations from southern departure points, the flight paths don't appear to make much sense. They always go, far towards the north to get into the south. But when you map those same flight paths out onto the AE projection, they actually line up pretty straight. And so, there has been a lot of angst and people jumping ship because of the AE projection, although I think a lot of the problems are perceived problems. So, for example, the further south you go on this projection, the more and more stretched out these lines of latitude become, to the point of the South Pole here, where essentially a single point is stretched to infinity. And so you get this sort of warping effect, and the distance represented by this long curvilinear line of latitude is exaggerated. It actually isn't that long relative to this scale. And again, it really does appear that that is derived because the underlying matrix of the AE map appears to be a sphere. So that is a problem, although moving over to the next one that I wanted to look at, and I haven't looked into this much, but Flat Earth Crushed has recently introduced this sort of concept, or rather reintroduced it, because basically what this map is here, it is an AE projection just like this. However, instead of putting the center point on the North Pole, the center point is essentially very close to Egypt. And of course, Egypt, as many of you may well know, is the geographic center of landmass on the world. And so it does kind of make sense in some ways to at least hypothesize the map with Egypt in the very center of the sort of AE projection. Now, what you get here on this projection is really the only straight line in this is going to be the equator and this meridian here. Everything else is a curved line, although that isn't really a big problem. It appears you still get the central north of Polaris and the other stars making concentric rings with Polaris. This projection also appears to solve some of the questions with the counter-rotational stars in the south, although I really, again, I don't think that is as much of a big problem in the AE projection, simply because the stars are merely lights in the night sky, and we can't necessarily transcribe what we see up there down to the maps of the Earth. Although that works in many cases, I think more experimentation and observation needs to be done in the far south, astronomically and geodetically speaking. You also get the effect where, the northern edge of Europe and Asia are north of the United States on the opposite side of the pole. And of course, these rings are going to be east-west lines of latitude, and these sort of long curves are going to be north to south lines of longitude. So this sort of projection, what the claim is that the seasons, because again, I guess that's something I forgot to mention on the AE projection. Seasons are nicely explained on the AE projection, although people do have some issue with the solar angles, like the azimuth and angle to the sun on this projection. But again, when you're talking about birefringence and refraction, you can't necessarily trust your eyes when you're looking at the celestial objects. So, like for example, if you're standing knee deep in water and you're looking at a fish in the water, if you try to poke him with a spear, you're going to miss unless you account for the refraction. So if you're looking at that fish and someone 90 degrees to your left is looking at the same fish through the water, you guys wouldn't be able to triangulate on that fish because of the refraction. The only way you'd be able to accurately triangulate on that fish would be if you were to account for the proper amount of refraction. So while the seasons certainly do have an explanation on the AE projection, and again, that would just be like the sun making tighter circuits in the north during the northern summer and wider circuits in the south during the southern summer. On this sort of projection, what you would have is the sun making these sort of circuits during the northern summer, and then during the southern summer, it's going to start making these sorts of circuits. So the sun is basically, during the equinoxes, is going to switch from apparently going around the southern hemisphere to the northern and vice versa. One immediate problem I noticed with it would be right after the equinox, the sun would have to drastically change its course to where you should see a very drastic change in the sun angles directly after each equinox. And so that is kind of a problem unless perhaps we've got two instances of the sun which are always 24 hours apart from one another, and that might actually work out. So each one of those suns would take 48 hours to orbit once in either hemisphere, and it would be bound to each hemisphere depending on the season, northern summer or southern summer. Now apparently the solar observation angles work pretty nicely on this sort of layout, and I think it definitely needs to be looked at more intensely. Now it may seem a little bit off the wall at first, but I think that something like this may answer a lot of questions that we have. And again, it isn't very far off from what we've all been using. Again, there are some perceived problems with both of these, and I'm not going to get into all the problems. I just want to sort of go over these couple of things because, I think that once we're able to really survey the far south and the far north as well, and really get a good idea of what's going on here or here in the Antarctic, we'll be able to really flesh out and hammer out a working and accurate model. Although I will again reiterate that a working and accurate model is absolutely not necessary to prove the lack of motion and lack of curvature of the Earth. Right. So finally, we're going to look at the linear, or as it's dubbed, the pac-man model, because there are a lot of people that have been trying to convince me to look at this and basically calling me stupid because I don't talk about it. And I disagree. I don't think it's stupid to not talk about something that seems unrealistic to me, especially when it comes to something to do with the flat Earth. Now, I could be totally wrong here, but the only problem that this map seems to solve is the problem of apparent distances between distances in the southern hemisphere. Now, again, there does appear to be a lot of evidence that the latitude lines in the far south are longer around than their respective latitude lines in the north, while this map has bilateral symmetry with those latitude lines. So unless those South Sea mariners were totally wrong in their reckoning, then this map is disagreeing with what they were reporting about actual distances from these three southern points, which when traveled at an average of 45 degrees south, exceeds 22,000 nautical miles, which is actually in excess of the Earth's equator, physically impossible on a ball, and physically impossible in this model. So I think that some verification of Rowbotham's assertions about the distances between these 3 points being 8,000, 8,000, and 6,000 miles for a total of 22,000 nautical miles, if we can verify that, we can very easily debunk this map as well as the globe with that one key point. Now, another sort of issue with this one is the lines of longitude become wider and wider the further east and west you go, and I don't see any sort of precedent for that, although I couldn't tell you. I've never sailed each line of longitude to measure its distance. But the other big problem with this that I'll just go ahead and mention is the whole idea of circumnavigation. Now, it's claimed by the people who believe in this map that if you travel west from this point, you instantly sort of morph over to this point like Pac-Man does. And that's how you get circumnavigation. But I gotta tell you, if this map were presented to me the first time I looked into flat Earth, I would have totally ignored the topic. I would have thought it was stupid because it absolutely does not explain circumnavigation. The other thing would be the sun circling the Arctic Circle in the north during the northern solstice months. There is pretty good video evidence of the North Arctic sun going around in several circuits during the northern solstice. And I just don't see how you're going to get that effect if the sun is traveling along, these lines of tropics. I don't see how that works. Even if you grant for argument's sake that it's doing this Pac-Man thing, how do you get the circling effect around the top? How do you get the circling effect of the stars around the North Pole star? And as much as I am against transcribing astronomy to make maps, it really does appear that if you head towards the North Star, go over the North Pole, and then keep going on the anti-meridian of your original course of travel, you're going to end up exactly where the globe and the AE projection tell you. And that makes a lot of sense, especially when we can see with our eyes that the stars go in circuits around Polaris. So the center of the map really isn't argued, and I don't think it needs to be. Maybe it does, but I just don't think that it does need to be argued. I don't see how that works. So, between these three, I guess you could say models, but really they're just projection maps. And quite frankly, I still believe this map, and this map are all constructed around the original assumption of a globe. So you've got the lines of latitude and longitude mapped around a hypothetical globe, the continents positioned on that globe, and then transposed to each one of these models. So if that's the case, then none of these models could be correct because they all have the inherent flaw of the globe Earth built right into them. So we may have to literally start from scratch. And I think that while there is a great deal of astronomical data and transposition of that data to real mapping in the northern hemisphere, or semi-plane, the same cannot be said about the south. And most of the world maps throughout history were constructed strictly in the northern hemisphere. China, Russia, Greece, Egypt, all of these places are in the northern hemisphere. And other than some very pre-Columbian ancient cultures, do you find any advanced astronomy in the southern hemisphere? And I'm not 100% sure whether the natives of Australia were into astronomy or not. I don't think they were, but maybe I'm wrong. And in the southern portion of Africa, you do have the thing called Adam's calendar. So perhaps there were ancient civilizations that were very interested in astronomy in the long past, although that has apparently been lost to history. Some of those things are being rediscovered, like I said, Adam's calendar. And when we see these accounts of far southern mariners from hundreds of years ago who assumed that the Earth was a ball for their reckoning using the stars and consistently found themselves very, very distant from where they reckon themselves to be based on this globe Earth astronomy. And it really does appear by these accounts that there is a lot more area in the south than there is in the north. And the fact that the southern seas were not mapped as thoroughly as the seas in the north, historically speaking, then we just don't have all of these hard, tried and true maps of the far south, and we have the Antarctic Treaty to prevent us from getting such maps. With that, I guess that wraps up this short video on the flat Earth maps. There's not a whole lot of sense in venturing out on limbs when it comes to flat Earth theorizing, because we certainly have our work cut out for us just getting people to understand the basic proofs, the fundamental, verifiable, self-evident facts which disagree with the heliocentric premise. And so we certainly do have a body of tangible empirical evidence to prove the flat Earth and debunk the heliocentric theory. In that respect, it is unwise to start venturing into theoretical things about the maps and astronomy, because it is a complex topic, and unless we have answers to these questions, then we really should stick to what we can prove and what we know. And now once we do start getting answers to a lot of these questions, like what exactly is going on in the far south, is it a ring around us, is it a single continent, is it the bottom of the Pac-Man map, I don't know. But I do know that the Earth isn't a spinning ball. It's not in motion, doesn't have curvature, it's not spinning, not orbiting, it's not a ball. But in terms of whether or not any of these maps are accurate, I don't know. I really don't think I can get behind any of them. But if I had to pick one, I'm going with the AE projection. And that's just me. You can call me stupid, you can call me gullible. The AE projection has a lot going for it. And frankly, if it turns out the TEA or the T projection is more along the lines of correct, well, frankly, it's exactly the same thing as the AE projection, where you just take the center point and put it over Egypt, or put it over basically Central Africa. And this one here, I just got to say, I don't understand how people are telling me that I'm stupid because I don't believe that circumnavigation works like a Pac-Man warp. I have not seen any evidence for this, and even if it's true, I don't see how you could ever prove it. I think if you were to show evidence that the sun, like when you're in the Arctic Circle in the northern solstice, if the sun were to head to a certain point in the west and then instantly appear on your east, then I could get behind this. Or if, like, the stars that go around the North Pole star went from left to right and then Pac-Man over to the right, in a sort of conga line, infinite fish eating its tail conga line, then I could get behind it. But for the people that have tried to convince me of this map, I haven't heard any arguments except for, well, I think that there's maybe one thing that makes some sense is the equatorial sundials argument. But again, that's if you're completely ignoring the fact that sunlight must travel through the atmosphere and the magnetic field of the Earth. And so what we see with our eyes in terms of celestial lights is not necessarily an accurate depiction of what's going on up there. Maybe it is, but perhaps it's not. And so it is with that regard that I still reserve that maybe there is something funky going on in the heavens with this whole Pac-Man effect, but I'm just not able to get on board with it, although I'm certainly not going to diss anybody who believes in it. I just, I would like to see some evidence for this sort of map projection before ever getting behind it. And, the problems with the AE projection are more perceived problems, and I think they really do stem that the AE projection begins with a globe model that's basically squished down. And this one would have that same thing built into it, and this one as well. So, sort of repeating myself here, but I guess you guys get the gist. Thanks so much for watching. If you'd like to support this channel, you can make a one-time contribution through PayPal to www.paypal.me/themorgile, or you can make a recurring contribution through Patreon for as little as $1 a month to www.patreon.com/themorgile. And I just want to give a big shout out and thanks to everyone that has helped out the channel and supported. It really means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. God bless you guys. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace out.